fascinating research from the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences, one of our premier academic programs in arts and sciences. Many of you learned of Professor Patrick Hill's research through a feature story in the Ampersand magazine, a new publication we launched this fall. Arts and sciences faculty and students are doing truly incredible work here on our campus and throughout our community. And I look forward to sharing more of their stories in future issues of the magazine. Showcasing Professor Hill's research in the Purpose, Aging, Transitions, and Health Lab was an easy choice. His work applies to each of us on a deeply personal level, and his findings are both intriguing and motivating. I'm not surprised that so many of you have joined us to learn more about his research, and I was personally very much looking forward to it. We are so fortunate to have a distinguished alumnus leading the discussion today. Sherman A. James earned his doctorate in psychology from Washington University in 1973, after earning his bachelor's degree in psychology and philosophy from Talladega College in Alabama. Dr. James is the Susan B. King Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Public Policy in the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. He also held secondary professorships at Duke in sociology, community and family medicine, and African American studies. Prior to joining Duke, he taught in the epidemiology departments at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and at the University of Michigan. At Michigan, he was the John P. Kirst Collegiate Professor of Public Health, the founding director of the Center for Research on Ethnicity, Culture, and Health, chair of the Department of Health Behavior and Health Education, and a senior research scientist in the Survey Research Center at the Institute for Social Research. His research focuses on the social determinants of racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic disparities in health and healthcare in the United States. He is the originator of an idea known as the John Henryism hypothesis. This important concept posits that repeated high-effort coping with social and economic stressors rooted in systemic racism contributes to significant health disparities in African Americans. Dr. James has won numerous prestigious awards and recognitions, and for the sake of time, I'll just mention a few. He has received the Abraham Lilienfeld Award and the Wade Hampton Frost Award, both from the American Public Health Association, and a Health Policy Investigator Award from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Dr. James is a member of premier professional and academic organizations, including the National Academy of Medicine, the American Academy of Political and Social Science, and the American Heart Association. Here at WashU, he won the Arts and Sciences Distinguished Alumni Award in 2008, and he has served on the Arts and Sciences National Council since 2014. In 2016, Dr. James delivered Washington University's annual Martin Luther King Jr. commemorative lecture. So he's an incredible, valuable member of our community, and I'm thrilled that he's with us today to lead our discussion. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sherman James.
Thank you very much, Dean Yu. That was a very generous introduction. I'm very grateful. Well, I'm really delighted to moderate what I know will be an interesting discussion with Dr. Patrick Hill about his research on how living with a sense of purpose contributes to positive life outcomes such as improved social, economic, psychological, and physical well-being. It is now my pleasure to introduce him. Dr. Hill is an associate professor of psychological and brain sciences at Washington University in St. Louis, or WashU, as we affectionately refer to it. He earned his bachelor's degree in psychology and economics from Indiana University and his master's and doctoral degrees in cognitive psychology from University of Notre Dame. At WashU, Dr. Hill is a founding director of the Purpose, Aging, Transitions, and Health Lab, or PATH Lab for short, where he and his students seek to understand how people explore options for and ultimately commit to a purpose in life, and how having a sense of purpose predicts health, wealth, and a sense of well-being from adolescence into older adulthood. Timely and increasingly important research questions. Hello and welcome, Dr. Hill.
Thank you so much. That's such an honor to get to be here today with you and to get to discuss this work. And thank you for this kind introduction.
Yes, of course. So before we get started, I want to thank everyone who submitted questions ahead of time. We received many interesting questions for this fascinating topic that we're going to discuss. Far more questions than we can address in the limited time that we have, but Dr. Hill has agreed to engage in follow-up discussions with you by email if we don't get to your particular question today. So I'll get us started by asking some questions that reflect common themes that emerged in a number of the questions that we received. I'll give Dr. Hill about 25 minutes or so to answer these questions, and then I'll open it up for questions which I invite you to submit through the Q&A box at the bottom of the webinar screen. You may do this while Dr. Hill and I are chatting. So, Dr. Hill, the first question is, how did you become interested in this line of research?
It's an interesting story that this was not something I ever really intended to do when I started as an undergrad. I actually went to undergrad to be a finance major, so it was not at all related to going into psychology. And the first classes in psychology really took my interest, took my enthusiasm, and I've been in it ever since. And when it came to the purpose work, this was really sparked during my time at Notre Dame. My graduate advisor was interested in adolescent moral development. How do adolescents find their sense of morality, their sense of moral identity? And as part of that work, some of our initial studies into purpose looked at how alumni at the University of Notre Dame, how they fared years later in middle adulthood. And one thing just kept popping up as a really strong predictor of midlife development, midlife well-being, and that was a sense of purpose and a sense of direction, that students who left Notre Dame with a clearer sense of what goals they had for life were experiencing better outcomes 14 years later. And it's kind of a fascinating thing to consider what you left university with has such a profound impact on your life later. And that's where we got interested in sense of purpose and have been showing for over a decade now the value of leading this purposeful life at every stage of the lifespan. So that was kind of our initial spark, and our initial interest came from that original grad student work.
Yeah, oh, that's interesting. It's always good to know what the origin story is behind the research agenda that academics pursue. So what are some of the most important findings from your research so far?
We've alluded to a few of them in the kind introductions earlier, but most of our work is fallen into kind of three camps. One of which was demonstrating the value of a purposeful life and having a sense of purpose. And the main findings that we've demonstrated there show purposeful adults seem to live longer, healthier, happier lives, and even wealthier lives in some ways, of being able to save for the future better, being able to build net worth over time better. And the second line of work has been focused on why is that the case? So if sense of purpose is showing all these profound benefits to health and well-being, why may that occur? And we've been demonstrating a lot of things in the lab related to who lives healthier lifestyles, as well as my graduate student, Gabrielle Fund, has been doing some fascinating work on social relationships and how that plays an important role in understanding why purpose holds such a profound impact. Of purposeful people seem to be better at building romantic relationships, building social support, and so forth. And now this has led to the third line of work for us, is really dedicated to how people find their purpose and direction in life. And I'm sure several of the questions are going to be related on that front. But we've been doing some work recently about how major life experiences may play a prominent role. And my other graduate student mentioned in the Ampersand article, Megan Wilson, has been doing some interesting work around how people become activists for social change. And we've been developing new measures and new ideas around how purpose can play a role in social movements and social change over time. And that's the newest line of our work, so I don't have any key findings yet, but we're really excited for that going forward, is continuing on all three of those fronts with new and interesting students coming in. So
I am sure. Well, you touched on what we in the trade refer to as mechanisms or pathways. How do we explain the association between having a strong sense of purpose and these positive self outcomes? And you touched on social relationships as a large literature, as you well know, on how being socially integrated, socially embedded in supportive relationships can promote health and longevity. What are some of the other mechanisms? I guess I'm particularly interested in things like health habits, for example.
Yes.
What can you tell us about
that? Yeah, I think that's probably the main mechanism we've worked through thus far is, as we mentioned, sense of purpose seems to predict longer lifespans, or who is at reduced risk for early mortality, which is kind of a fascinating finding that's been shown by my lab and several labs around the world. So why might that be the case? And one of the big things is health behaviors and health habits. So we find that people who report this commitment to goals for life, people who report a stronger sense of direction going forward, if you consider what those individuals are striving towards, in most cases, being healthier and being in better shape is going to help you towards those goals, whatever they may be, whether they are health related, family related, financial or occupational related. Being in better health is one of the resources that one may play upon to continue living a purposeful life. And what we have found in a number of studies conducted in the United States, as well as studies over in Europe and elsewhere, is that purposeful individuals report a greater engagement with health behaviors like physical exercise. They report better dietary habits. And in line with this idea that if you're building for the future, you might expect that all of these health habits are playing an important role. And another main predictor or a main mechanism involved in this is stress reactivity. So we've done a number of studies recently looking at what is the daily life of someone who feels purposeful? What does that look like? What kinds of activities do they do? And a consistent finding in connection or collaboration with my colleagues at the University of British Columbia, like Nancy Sin, is demonstrating that purposeful individuals seem to be less reactive to their daily life or to their daily events. For instance, on days when people feel stressed out or feel a stressor, you tend to have more negative affect. You tend to feel more physical symptoms, like we've all had stressful days and we all kind of know what that feels like. But those effects seem to be somewhat lessened for people who have this direction in life, people who have this sense of purpose in life. And it may be because everyday stressors are less impactful when you have this goal that you're striving towards going forward, that you can, to borrow the phrase from a lot of self-help books, like you could avoid sweating the small stuff when you have this big thing that you're focusing on. And what's been interesting is we've been doing some recent work showing what this looks like in the context of the pandemic, as well as what this looks like in the context of positive events. And even when it comes to positive events, purposeful individuals are not as excited by them at times as individuals who are lower on a sense of purpose. And one reason may be that they, again, are thinking ahead to the future of something that's really going to continue providing them positive events, and they anticipate these things occurring more frequently in their lives. So that's one of the current lines of work that I've been emailing with colleagues about today and trying to discern from a recently collected data set what kinds of expectations do purposeful people have for their lives, which may help them to reduce their stress and anxiety, which of course, as you well know, is a huge predictor of a number of health concerns down the road. So those are some of the other major mechanisms that our lab has been focused on. Oh, I think you're muted, sorry.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. You alluded to collaborative work. I think you said you research a colleague at British Columbia, was it?
Yes.
Right. So you've done some cross-cultural work, I guess, at least cross-national. Do your findings generalize across different demographic groups? For example, race, ethnicity, social class, gender. Do you find similar kinds of things across these different demographic categories?
That's a great question, and something that our lab has been focused on more and more recently. And thus far, we tend to find that race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status have not necessarily changed the picture when it comes to positive benefits associated with purpose. So we've been doing work with samples of Indigenous First Nations adults in Vancouver, and sense of purpose is valuable for their health and well-being. We've been doing work with Native Hawaiians, so a large part of my work has been looking at the cultural context of Hawaii and showing that among that sample, there doesn't seem to be anything that's necessarily leading purpose to be less beneficial. And recently, we have a paper out with Emily Wilroth, who is going to join us soon here at WashU, luckily, as a professor, that she and I demonstrated that in samples in the United States, as well as a targeted sample of Black African-American adults, and in a sample of Japanese adults, we found similar effects of how changes in purpose and levels of purpose still predicted health outcomes down the road across all of these groups. Now, maybe their magnitude was slightly different, but overall, the picture has been pretty consistent, and we're still looking for things that may shape when and for whom it may be more beneficial.
Right. Interesting. Okay, so maintaining a sense of purpose during major life transitions, such as retirement, is a key focus of your research. And we received a number of questions about finding purpose in one's life after retirement. So here's one such question. Quote, I keep myself very busy in retirement, but I still can't clearly define my purpose. Do I really need to define my sense of purpose? Now that I'm retired, why can't my purpose just be to rest after a long career?
That's a great question. And we get this a lot, that I think this is something we've been doing more work on is, we recently had a paper published about perceptions of retirement and whether people expect to be purposeful in their retirement or not. And like this question, it's not the case that everybody wants their retirement to be as goal-directed, and for a lot of reasons, may be better spent as a time of respite and taking a break. So I think to answer the question, certainly well-being, certainly positive affect during retirement is not contingent upon being able to name your purpose, that a lot of individuals have a very pleasant retirement without necessarily feeling purposeful and directed. It's just that one finding from that paper was the majority of people that we surveyed still expected to be purposeful or still desired to be purposeful following retirement. And I think that's an interesting piece of the puzzle in terms of you could imagine that declines in purpose following retirement were due to just people not desiring purposefulness, or that are finding that sense of purpose might be going down with retirement, may be related to wanting more time for relax and rest. And that's certainly true for some of our sample, but we still have quite a bit of a majority of the sample that we've been looking at that are desiring some kind of a purposeful goal in retirement. And for those people, it certainly seems to be valuable or important, but maybe not for everybody, I guess.
Right. So here's a related question. How can senior citizens, some of whom may have retired involuntarily, still manage to use their talents and pursue meaningful life goals despite our culture of age discrimination?
That's an excellent question, and something that has become an increasing focus of the lab. We're about to present a poster for a conference next month where my graduate student, Megan Wilson, found sense of purpose being negatively related to ageist attitudes. So we're looking into first demonstrating that people with a higher sense of purpose seem to be less likely to hold these ageist attitudes in general. And now what does that mean for implications of age discrimination is kind of the next step. One thing to consider here is certainly that not everybody is retiring on their own volition. So returning to that part of the question, my former thesis student here at WashU, Rachel Best, has been doing work on how the reason for retirement really matters when it comes to changes in sense of purpose. That aligned with this question, we find individuals who retire for perhaps less positive reasons, retire for reasons outside of their own control, are reporting a reduced sense of purpose. And it's a really important goal for us going forwards to help individuals still feel purposeful during retirement. And a couple of ways that we've been working with people in retirement communities here and elsewhere with at least 2 or 3 paths to maybe helping to maintain purposefulness or define purposefulness. One of which is the social interactions that in community settings we find that older adults in retirement communities or in older adult communities tend to feel more purposeful, feel more connected when they are able to do things for others in that community. So that's been a major focus of our work, is helping individuals recognize the value and importance of their endeavors and activities for the people around them in their community. The other major line, excuse me, of this work is helping to dispel the belief that purpose needs to be this giant overarching thing that's impacting everyone around you. that I know when I talk to retirement communities, they hear the definition of purpose and immediately are like, oh my goodness, that how could I have this big thing that's directing me? How could I have these very large ideals? And I try to encourage them to start with, what are the things that are most meaningful to you? What are the things that start you up in the morning and get you motivated? And when you identify what those meaningful activities are, when you identify what is most contributing to your sense of connection, your sense of goal direction, it may be something that seems kind of small to others, but it shouldn't be something that seems small to you, that it's something that is still quite meaningful and can provide you that sense of goal direction going forward. So I think that's one of the big things that our research program recently has taken to task, these kinds of endeavors to find this big thing that is your purpose, because it could be dissuading people from finding what is actually motivating them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, moving now to a different stage of the life cycle, adolescence.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a two-part question for you. What has your research uncovered about how adolescents generally approach developing a sense of purpose in life? And for adolescents who have trouble finding a sense of purpose, what are some ways that parents and/or teachers can help them find a sense of purpose?
That's a great question. And one reason it's a great question is I have to give a talk about this next week. So I've been preparing my slides and hopefully have an answer for you. So let me start with one reason that our work tends to focus on these two points of the lifespan. Like, a lot of our research is on adolescent and university students, as well as older adults, is there are two periods of lifespan where individuals are starting or have an opportunity to explore what is really driving them or their goals for life. So just like retirement provides this option or this opportunity to do things that perhaps continue your sense of purpose from work or lead you towards a completely different direction, adolescence is that other time in which you're really opening several doors to finding your direction. And our work was some of the first studies to provided some of the first studies to demonstrate that adolescents are in fact thinking about purpose and direction, even early in high school and in middle school, that they are considering purpose the same way that we as researchers are. They're considering it as this foundation for their goal advancement and direction for their goals, which allows you to then consider what can we do to help and what is the trajectory of purpose during this period. So the first thing that we've demonstrated is individuals in adolescence who are able to start to pin down who they are, what we would call a sense of identity or a sense of identity commitment. Understanding who you are is a big step towards understanding where you're going to go, with where you're going to go being kind of your direction or purpose in life. So part of this process in adolescence is thinking through what is your identity and what is your sense of self. Another part of this where parents, mentors, and teachers really play an important role is understanding that youth may need support and help along the way. So this process is not easy. If it were easy to find a purpose in life, this Zoom session would be a lot quicker and we'd already be done with questions. But it's particularly difficult for youth who are trying out new things for the first time. They're making decisions on their own for the first time. And one way that parents, teachers, and mentors can help out is providing them support during a time in which it may be kind of anxiety producing to try new things and to be exploring who you are and where you want to go, these kinds of big picture questions. We see this in my lab when undergraduates first volunteer in the lab, the first month or so, it's almost like they have this existential dread of like, oh wait, now that I see how important purpose is, I don't know where I'm going. So what we've been trying to do is help support them during the lab activities towards understanding that it's not an easy process, first off, and understanding there are lots of different ways to go about it. And the other role that parents, teachers, and mentors can play is in providing these different opportunities. So we find that a lot of youth uncover their purpose in life because they are exploring new things. So just like I said at the start, my direction kind of came from taking my first psych classes at Indiana University, that I was never going down this path until that moment. Adolescents and university students who get these opportunities to explore different paths and to take different courses, do different extracurriculars, with the knowledge that not one thing fits for everybody. That's another important role that parents and everyone can play in the development of purpose among adolescents.
Well, I'll ask you just one more question from the pool of advanced questions that we received, and then we'll open it up for new questions from the audience. I already see that we have a number of questions that have come in. So how do you go about recruiting people to participate in your research projects?
It takes a multifaceted approach. So as you all know, a lot of health and health psychology research requires use of samples that have been previously collected, because we need these long-term studies to understand mortality risk and health risks and so forth. So some of our work that's mentioned in that article were studies that we didn't necessarily collect, but we were grateful to the people who have been doing this work for decades now, collecting information on sense of purpose, including my colleagues at the University of Wisconsin and Northwestern and elsewhere. When it comes to our own research, some studies are done pretty quickly using online samples. So if we're interested in a general question, like for instance, when we were investigating age discrimination, ageism, purpose, my grad student Megan went and collected a sample across the United States online and had them complete these surveys that way. We've done a couple of studies recently in the community with partners at the Med Center and Medical School here at WashU. And those samples thus involve participants who may be going in for health appointments or checkups, kind of more select samples that allow us to investigate that process of receiving or not receiving a diagnosis and so forth. So a lot of our studies on health and cognitive aging involve partnerships with the wonderful people here at the med school. And otherwise, most of our work has been kind of recruited through those pieces. And we're hoping next year to perhaps once we have more availability for people to come into the lab post-pandemic, we'll be able to start recruiting from the community again for some new studies.
Okay. Okay, so let's go to some questions from the audience. Elise Atkins asks, I am recently with an almost empty nest and on disability after a long career, a forced retirement in a sense for which I am unprepared and now physically limited. Do you have any advice for me?
So it's a difficult question because I know this comes up a lot with regard to individuals still trying to maintain a sense of purpose despite potential limitations of all forms. And one thing that we recommend is thinking through if you had a sense of direction previously, or if you had goals previously that were guiding you, finding new ways to engage with those goals, despite potential limitations, has been part of our strategy for working with health samples. And another thing that we've been discussing is the use of accessible tools for helping individuals, say, maintain social contact through virtual or telephone-based systems to maintain that ability to connect with others, which we've said frequently is such an important part of maintaining a sense of purpose. So thinking about this when it comes to an empty nest, I think that's a big part of still being able to feel that sense of connection and still feeling like you're able to provide and be generative to those around you and your family, your friends, your peers. So I think that's another recommendation that we've been putting forward and has come about recently when we've been discussing how do you feel purposeful during a pandemic. So I know that was something we were all dealing with, of how can you still evidence your impact on others when you might be physically distant or unable to see them. So that's, I think with the advent of some of these new technologies and some of these new methods that we've been able to utilize during the pandemic, that's giving us some new insights into how to help individuals who might be socially distanced or limited in certain respects to engage with others.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So Kathy wants to know, how does the lab define purpose?
That's a good question. Should have started up. So what we do is look at purpose in two primary ways. A lot of the work that's mentioned in the Ampersand article is related to our research on sense of purpose. So this is your felt perception that you have direction in life, that you have goals in life, and that you are engaged with your life. So a number of our survey studies ask people to complete questionnaires that ask things like, I have a sense of purpose and direction. I do a lot of things that keep me engaged with life. I have commitments that direct me through my life. So all of that is capturing this idea that all of us can feel this purposefulness, or this sense that you have purpose and direction that guide you from every day. So that's most of our work, because it's frankly easier to collect some of that data than what we often call like the big P purpose, like the capital purpose in life, reflecting this idea, like what is the purpose, or what is the content of your goals for life. So we define that with respect to a purpose in life is something broad that engages you from day to day and sets forth your short and longer term goals, as well as provides you that sense of self-definition. So talking about adolescence again, this is why identity and purpose are so intertwined, that once you know what your purpose is, it can really be impactful for how you define yourself going forward, and the kinds of engagements you set forward, the kinds of roles that you take on. So in that regard, we've been doing some work primarily asking people to describe what their purpose is, or describe what gives them that sense of direction. And we encourage people to note that it shouldn't really be something that is necessarily achievable. That seems kind of an odd way of saying it, but if you have this goal, like let's say my purpose in life was to be a professor, now I'd be like, well, okay, what do I do now? Because it leaves you with that sense of achievement, but also loss in some ways. So we encourage people to set a purpose that is bigger and broader in nature. Like for me, perhaps it is not to be a professor, but to spread knowledge or to advance science, something that I can continue doing both during my work life and after retirement. So that gives some insight into how purpose in life is a much more difficult question and one that I know a lot of people wrestle with. And I would say that it's not something, if you cannot name it right now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a self-reflective process that we can all kind of go in and out of over time. So don't worry if you're not able to answer that big P purpose question right now. So,
yeah. Okay, so here's a question for which there's a fair amount of interest among members of the audience. Do you have, or do you recommend a particular formal process for helping people identify their purpose? Is there a process that you have uncovered that would help people move more quickly toward identifying the sense of purpose?
It's something that we're really working on now with respect to both adolescent and older adults, trying to create intervention programs and trying to create policies around this. And I can say that while a lot of that is still in progress, and stay tuned, that maybe they'll invite me back for another article in a decade or something. But right now we've been focusing on 3 pathways to purpose that our work has identified by virtue of when we ask people, how did you find your purpose? A lot of people mention at least one of these 3 ways. So one of which is aligned with how we think about college and university, namely this more proactive pathway, that people who are actively engaged with seeking out new activities, new goals, new opportunities. So when this comes to older adulthood, we've been encouraging people to be more open to new experiences. That seems to be something that is important, particularly if you didn't necessarily feel purpose directed by your work, that maybe this is your opportunity for something new and something purposeful in that direction. A second way, in addition to trying new things and trying new paths and this kind of trial and error piece, is a more self-reflective or reactive pathway. And the best way of describing this is all of us have those kinds of major life events that have shaped us in some way, that you can recall something that happened to you or a family member or a friend that really shook your mindset or shook what was meaningful and important to you in your life. So reflecting upon those major events, or just reflecting upon, as we said earlier, what are the things that you deem really meaningful to you, can be one way of helping to identify, like, if you had lost that, or if you had not experienced that event, you would be a very different person. That's one sign that this might be something for you to pursue as kind of a life direction or pathway. So doing more self-reflection, doing, some people are able to say directly, like, because of this health ailment that happened to my family member, or because of this epiphany that I experienced, I knew exactly which way I was going to go. So I think that's one path that a lot of people can take, of just kind of reflecting upon what is meaningful and important to you. The final thing that we've been encouraging is more of a social, what we're calling social learning, but kind of like a mentorship approach, in which there are important people in your life that may have shown you what it meant to be purposeful, or gave you some goals or some ideas of goals that you might want to pursue. So for me, I always mention, this work is very related to what I think of my mom. My mom was an elementary art teacher for 4 decades. And even though I am a terrible artist, I never pursued that pathway for life. It led me to recognize the value of leading kind of a purposeful, goal-directed life, that she clearly had that motivation to continue and was excited by her work every day to help children learn art. So in that regard, I had this kind of social mentor, or this figure in my life that allowed me to recognize the value of a purposeful life that I could kind of mimic in some ways. And I know a lot of programs promoting healthy aging have been increasingly focused on this idea of healthy elders or healthy exemplars of individuals still very goal-directed, very motivated late in the lifespan. And, you know, whether or not you have personal contact with those individuals, you could possibly read literature by them, you could look through what they did. And I think there's great opportunities in every stage of the lifespan to kind of use these mentors towards understanding both what purpose is and what you could possibly be doing to help find your purpose as a result of what they found successful.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we still have a number of questions. Let's see how many
Sorry, I'm long-winded.
Let's see how many we can get through in the few remaining minutes we have. Here's an interesting question from James. It may take you a little bit beyond where you are now in your research, but I think it's an interesting and important question. James asks, with Chancellor Martin's push for Washington University in St. Louis, could you see any future studies being able to help areas of the city with various challenges, for example, high school dropout rates, unemployment, and so on? So some of the more distressed parts of the city of St. Louis, where, you know, young people, youth, may be struggling to find a sense of purpose. What are your thoughts?
That's certainly something that our lab is very focused on going forward, is being an active part of this community. So we are currently part of a study that has been looking at St. Louisians for the past 10 or so years, and now starting to ask questions for their children and grandchildren of these original participants to understand what is the role of generational experiences on your development of a sense of purpose. So starting to tease apart what is impactful about the St. Louis experience, what are the influences that parents have here in St. Louis on a sense of purpose and direction. And this sample is broadly across the St. Louis city and county area. So it's giving us a wide range of different experiences with respect to opportunities or lack of opportunities to find a sense of direction. So one thing that we've been engaged with here and elsewhere is understanding how to help youth of every background to find a sense of direction and purpose. And this is part of what I'm discussing next week, I think I mentioned earlier. And one major part of this is to understand what are the current circumstances, obstacles, and perceived obstacles to a purposeful life. And my graduate student, Megan, has been working on that with some studies here in St. Louis and elsewhere, as well as once we identify those obstacles. So that's kind of the first step to addressing this question. Then moving forward to, as was mentioned with respect to Andrew Martin's goals, considering what we can do in collaboration with partners here in the St. Louis community. So I've been meeting with a few groups recently to talk through what could be done. And I think this is kind of a key opportunity that, with hopefully a more positive climate regarding the pandemic, that we're going to have more opportunities to engage with the community going forward. And again, this is more going to be a question of stay tuned, but I think this is something that is essential, and everyone in this, I'm in the psych building, everyone in this building should be working towards, is a greater connection with the St. Louis community and finding ways to help youth, and as we do also older adults in that community, to find this direction in life, particularly given some of the unfortunate circumstances and difficult environments that they may be facing elsewhere. So I think we do have a lot of studies recently that have given us hope in terms of, for instance, my graduate student, Gabrielle Fund, has demonstrated socioeconomic status is not necessarily related very strongly to a sense of purpose. So that's a good starting point of
Yes.
demonstrating it's not necessary in order to feel a purposeful life. And Megan Wilson has been working on how majority versus minority identity status plays a role in sense of purpose, and again, finding often very few differences when it comes to individuals who identify with a majority or minority status with respect to race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual identity. So we are heartened by the fact that these factors do not seem to be necessarily risk factors in some regards. But again, these are, I recognize, preliminary steps to doing the meaningful, important work that's alluded to by this question.
Right. Well, that's really interesting and encouraging. So here's another question. I am curious to hear your thoughts about the relationship between purpose and collective identities. Do you see evidence that those who routinely serve others, or quote unquote, a greater good, feel a greater sense of purpose? If yes or no, is that reflected in life satisfaction and or long-term outcomes such as health, predictability of adverse life events, and so on? So maybe just pick up on the first part of that, specifically the relationship between purpose and collective identities.
Yeah, so we do find that individuals who report greater volunteerism, greater connection to others, do tend to feel more purposeful in their lives. And when it comes to collective identity, there's a few ways of considering that in line with this question and the discussion of like serving others or a greater good. That is certainly one of the pathway, I shouldn't say pathway, I just use that term, one of the types of purpose that we routinely find in our studies. This is kind of pro-social, helping others aspect of purposefulness. I do often like to notify people that this is not the only way to feel purposeful. So I think some people get overwhelmed by that at times. So it's not the case that people who have a sense of purpose for other means, purpose more related to your work or to science or creative output, all of these purposes we've shown in our work do relate to positive outcomes down the road. As the question reflects, being part of a greater collective unit may be a valuable way to find purpose for several people. And I think my colleague at Cornell has been doing some really interesting work about how collective identity can be described at multiple levels of society. So whether you are feeling connected to those in your immediate context versus the broader societal context, the national context, and so forth, those different identities can often conflict with one another. So trying to figure out which of the collective identities is more impactful is a tricky element, but to the root of the question, I think it does help for several people to find that sense of connection.
Mm-hmm. So Barry asked, many purposeful activities actually create stress, like serving on nonprofit boards for challenged organizations. Wouldn't added stress degrade the value of purposeful efforts?
This is a great point and actually reflects something in our studies of daily life. I find one of the most intriguing and valuable findings is that sense of purpose is not related to fewer or more stressors in daily life. So I think a lot of people would immediately expect, if you're feeling purposeful in life, then it's going to be more stress-free, or like you're going to have fewer stressors. That's not the case, as this question points out, that a lot of the time, if you're being purposeful and engaged with your life, it's going to include more stressors, like teaching class or engaging at conferences and so forth can be stressful events, but they're part of my purpose and direction in life. So I think it's very important, like the question points out, that a purpose-free life is not a stress-free life. We're not saying that in any respect. And in fact, some of our studies show that purposeful individuals report more stressors in like the workplace or in education because they are doing more things. That being said, to the question about whether it degrades a purposeful life, if anything, it might be the reverse in some ways, that by doing these challenges, we find that individuals who report a more challenging work, a workplace that allows them to act with their strengths and to be more engaged with their work, they tend to report a stronger sense of purpose. So I think it depends on how you're viewing stressor in some ways, that a lot of these stressors that purposeful people are reporting more of may be challenges or opportunities that are still stressors in a lot of respects. But the main thing that we're finding is, regardless of stressor type, purposeful individuals seem to report less negative well-being as a result of those stressors. So in daily life, you may report a stressor, but it's going to have less of an impact on your physical symptoms, less of an impact on feeling down, depressed, anxious. But it in some ways demonstrates the value of a purposeful life to see how it plays out in stressor, in the context of a stressor in that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, we have just a minute left, and I actually want to give you, before I close the session today, I want to give you the opportunity to just comment on anything that you want to leave the audience with, anything that you wanted to share, but perhaps didn't get a chance to share because of the kinds of questions that were presented. So any closing comments?
I'm really excited by these questions, that I think everybody brought up such excellent questions. We've addressed so much of our lab in this hour, and there's so much more we could address, but I think I don't have much else to add that I think is an important point to get out there, other than, as we said earlier, I think it's important to recognize this is not an easy fix. This is not an easy one-size-fits-all process. And the more we recognize that, hopefully that allows for people to be encouraged to pursue their purpose more, or to pursue what their purpose is more, because they recognize, what worked for your friend may not work for you. So don't get downhearted if you feel that you didn't find the same pathway that somebody else did. We're all unique, and that's both the challenge and the excitement about studying purpose in life, is that everybody's purpose is slightly different from everybody else's. So I just encourage everybody to think through that for themselves and to reflect on what is meaningful for them. Yeah.
Right. Well, in terms of research in the social sciences and humanities, and it seems to me that your research really intersects with both the social sciences and the humanities, because you're dealing with questions of meaning and purpose. And God knows there are a lot of challenges, and so your research, has as one of the objectives, practical objectives, to help young people, as well as older people, but in particular young people, find their path, so that they can make the kinds of contributions to solving some of the pressing problems, that we face, as people all over the world. So your work is extremely important, and I want to thank you, for the work that you do. I think it's exciting. And we are now out of time. So on behalf of Arts and Sciences at Washington University, I want to thank everyone for attending today's session. We're sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions, but as I mentioned at the outset, Dr. Hill would be willing to follow up and talk with you about some of the things that you're interested in. So feel free to get in touch with him. So I want to thank him for participating in today's session, and for those of you who were able to attend for doing so. To learn more about the exciting research coming out of Arts and Sciences at WashU, we want you to save the date for the Power of Arts and Sciences Week, which will be a week of virtual events celebrating creativity, connection, and community with alumni and friends. And that week will be December the 6th through December the 10th. So thanks again, Dr. Hill, for joining us today, and we wish you continued success in your important research. Have a good evening, everyone.
You take care.